continue on with chapter 7, Humanity and Sin. Talking about the nature of man. We've already said quite a bit about this. We're composed of flesh and spirit. Now, it depends on how you use this. Some people are what they call dichotomous, some are called trichotomous. Do you know the difference?
One. One's two, one's three. It's one.
Well, dichotomy says that there's only two components to human nature. One is spirit, the other is body. And the term soul is synonymous with spirit. Another view is called trichotomy, which the word tri, and that is the spirit, soul, and body. So the spirit and soul are both non-material, but not the same. They're distinct from each other. So you have spirit, soul, and body. And it's not my intent to solve that problem right now with you. I'm a trichotomist as far as my thinking, but I think the Bible also emphasizes unity more than just the division. Orthodox view of humanity and sin on page 121. Scripture is very clear that each of us possesses a spirit that is distinct from our physical body and appears to be able to function somewhat independently of our normal thought processes. Can function consciously and relate to God even after we die. So, we don't know what that's like. Matter of fact, all of us will have an opportunity to understand that better later. It's not something we want to think about usually, but sometimes I think about it more and more the older I get, that the point of it is, unless Jesus comes, I'm going to experience what I've seen a lot of other people experience. Dying. Now, you don't think about yourself being that doesn't seem like me. How could I be there at the very end and all of a sudden, poof, I'm not there anymore, in the sense of I lose a sense of consciousness with this life. Of course, we know we don't lose consciousness, we just lose consciousness with this existence. And we continue on. In what respect that's so, I really do not know. I do know, however it is, that we'll be with the Lord. But I don't know exactly all that means. I think I've expressed in another context some of my views on that. Whether I'm right or not, I don't know, in reference to whether we, basically our next conscious thought is the resurrection. I know that's so or maybe not so, I don't know.
We will know whether you were right or wrong.
One day you'll know. You'll be able to say, Dr. House, you were right or you were wrong. One of the two.
And we'll be able to talk to you about that.
That's right. That's right. In my next class that I teach, I'm teaching makeup classes in eternity.
That'll be something to look at.
By passing the purgatory.
Put them all off until
The
eternity.
pressure will be off. We'll actually learn something.
No transfer credit.
Exams and papers.
I don't know about that, but we will have physical self. You know that's what's so funny about that. We may very well have things like typewriters and stuff to work. It's not as though the future world is a world in which we just sort of float around. Maybe we will do things productively and have things to work with. Well, God is not anti-matter, against matter. So I don't know. Maybe we will. Maybe we'll drive cars. I don't know. But however it works is we will have a future existence that comports with our physical bodies. Okay. In our physical universe, body and spirit act together in unison as one person. It's hard for me to distinguish, in a complete sense, our body and our spirit, our body and our soul. We tend to operate in a unison. Not only are we body and spirit, but we also are called Imago Dei, which means image of God, from the Latin. Now, there are different ways in which people understand Imago Dei. There's some who believe that the Imago Dei is the moral representation of God in humanity. Some people believe Imago Dei is actually the physical person. Some people believe Imago Dei refers to just the fact that we're spirit, or that we have mental and emotional and volitional aspects, the minds and the will and the emotions. Many understandings of what Imago Dei is, and probably it's a combination of some of these. In systematic theology, did you guys have anthropology with me? We went through these. And so, many different ways to deal with it. But one thing is the fact that we are those who represent God and those who are made like. God made us in such a way that we can communicate with Him. Animals don't have imago Dei. Animals seem to have some spirit of some sort, but a spirit that does not seem to survive the body, that animates the body, whereas our spirit is eternal. Animal spirits seem to be temporal. And our spirit is in such a way that we are in communion with God through our soul, our person, works through our spirit to God, whereas animals I don't think have that. You can read the various ways in which imago Dei and likeness and image and so forth have been used, but the doctrine of sin, page 124, says John Calvin articulated the best definition of sin possibly. This is the inherited corruption which the church fathers termed original sin, meaning by the word sin the deprivation of a nature previously good and pure. Now, I think you know from previous talks that I've done that I've stopped using the term sinful nature. Occasionally I might slip into it because it's such a normal term in our conversation. And lots of theologians use the term sinful nature. But the problem is sinful nature sounds like we have a human nature and then a nature called a sinful nature. We have two natures. I don't think we have two natures. I think we have a human nature that has been corrupted by sin. So I would prefer to say a sinful human nature or a fallen human nature or a human nature that has been corrupted by sin, but not make it seem as though human nature and sinful nature are the same thing, are somehow two different natures that we actually possess. So I think we have a fallen human nature. Human nature as God intended was not to be divine. In other words, even Adam and Eve did not have capacity like Benny Hinn used to argue that before the fall Adam actually used to fly around the planets and take off like Superman and run out and look around Pluto and Mercury and dance on the rings of Saturn and so forth. There's no evidence at all that those kind of things occurred. The human nature has limitations as God has created humans to be. Humans don't fly. It's part of us. We are connected to gravity. And humans walk, and we have arms and legs, and there are things about us that make us human. And we'll never be God. That's why in some areas kidding you about teaching. In fact, even in the afterlife, even after we go into the resurrected body, we will not be infinite knowledge. We'll still be learning. Learning for all eternity. And we will certainly probably have greater capacity for learning in whatever ways that sin in this world that we know now has somehow restricted our learning processes. It may be that we'll have greater capacity for learning, because as you well know, even right now, our physical brain uses so little, and maybe we'll have greater capacity then. I don't know. People speculate all sorts of things and act as though it's doctrine, but I don't know. But I do know that we will continue to learn because we'll be finite. And even angels continue to learn. Remember? That's one of the reasons why they look into the church and see what God is doing in salvation. They're actually learning as spirit beings. We will too. Sin finds itself expressed in different ways. Sin is known through guilt. The entire human race became guilty before God in the fall of Adam. All the race was in Adam. We all were in him. He's the representative for the entire race. When he sinned, we sinned. And we're held guilty before God, even as Adam. But that's guilt. Then there is the actual corruption that sin brought. That means that we're never born pure in this life. We're all born corrupted with a failure. But we're not condemned before God because we have corrupted nature. That's not the condemnation. The condemnation relates to the guilt. We in Adam, as guilty people, are judged to be people that deserve God's condemnation. And then we have sin on a personal level. We individually sin. And these things probably have something to do with this understanding, even what about people that are infantile in their thinking, or babies, or whatever. Not heathen, because they become adults and understand, and they have general revelation to work with. But it could be that a fetus in utero has guilt and has corruptible nature, but does not have personal sin. And so you have to decide what occurred at the cross. And that's for another discussion.
Can you go back and, I'm fuzzy here between corruption and guilt.
Guilt is judicial. Corruption is experiential. God declares us to be guilty in Adam. When Adam sinned, he was declared to be a person who had fallen short of God's standards. And those that are in Adam have been declared also to be short of God's standards and thus be unrighteous before God. As to judicial guilt. See, Jesus judicially was sinful. He was experientially sinless. Right? He was declared to be sin. And we are declared to be righteous. Righteousness is not my experience now. That's my judicial position.
Right.
And so we were declared to be guilty in our position before God, but we actually became experientially sinful in our own acts in our lives, right? We experientially sin. Guilt is a judicial claim against us.
But you said we were born corrupt.
Corruption deals with our experience of nature. Our human nature has fallen. And thus, because we are now corrupted, we respond to that in sin. One day we'll not have a corrupt nature. It appears that at the cross, Jesus clearly dealt with the guilt that Adam had formed. He became the second Adam. And even as Adam was guilty, Jesus was guiltless. And as Adam was declared to be condemned, Jesus then endured the condemnation of Adam that we might be declared righteous. But then we have our own sins that come out of our corruptible nature. So all three things are working, but they're a little different. Is that clear? You need more?
No, it's...
Okay. The doctrine of sin, then. Original sin, the sinful corruption of our nature, and our personal sin. There's a lot more that could be talked about here, but probably won't deal with all of it right now. Questions on the thing? Anything about the fact of our nature, sin, or image of God, or any of those things or the nature of human nature, before we move on to unorthodox teachings?
It's mentioned in Scripture that they were born dead in our trespasses and sins, so we were born dead, sort of like.
We are born separated from God because we are guilty before God, because we're impure before God, and obviously we're also because of our personal sins that eventually happen. I don't think an unborn child or a newborn child probably commits personal sins. I think personal sins require knowledge or understanding and intent. But they are born with a corruption to their nature that gives rise to sin when it's capable of being performed, and still stand guilty before God positionally, judicially.
Is this different than the Roman Catholic idea of original sin?
Well, it's in some sense the same. In Roman Catholic thought, original sin is usually relating to the fact of a sinful principle. I'm using that different. See, Roman Catholics don't really deal with the whole question of judicial sin very much. They don't deal with the idea of imputed sin of Adam. They deal more with the idea of corruption of our nature. They would tend to use that as original sin. And of course, they divide sins up, all their stuff on that video on Martin's work. But there's some similarities too. The point is we're sinners and unrighteous before God. Now, in reference to human nature in Mormonism, what is interesting, I have a tape I just got through doing. When I was in Tonga recently, I saw a couple Mormon missionaries on the road, and I stopped and taped them. And one of them, he was saying he came from Utah. That's his home. He was over in Tonga doing missionary work, but born in Utah. And I said, "Oh," I said, "Where?" And he said he was from Utah. And I said, "Well, where were you before Utah?" He said, "Heaven." I said, "What?" He said, "Yeah, I was in heaven before Utah." I said, "Well, that's interesting." I wasn't there to argue with the guy, but there's some view, at least Mormonism, what happens is that when the function of fertilization and creation of a human being is to provide a body for one of the pre-existent eternal spirits to be injected into a body. We need to find bodies for these people. And so that's what's happening, as you know. We also know that in human nature develops until finally you become like God. Mormons don't like to use the terminology anymore, clearly in their history. But as Smith said, Young said, Brigham Young, as God, let's see, as you are, God once was. As God is, you will be. In other words, God was once a human like us, and he got exalted, and if you keep it up, you'll be like God. So they believe in multiple deities. Matter of fact, in Mormonism, you can have millions of gods roaming around the universe, all starting their own little planets.
Polytheists.
Other polytheists, yeah, sure. They would be also they would also be henotheists. That is, they believe in multiple deities, but they worship one specific one. In other words, there's God over this planet, and that's a God they're worshiping, recognizing there are other gods. That's henotheism. A belief in many gods, but you've got your favorite one.
Can you repeat that real quick? As you are, God was.
It's in here, actually. Let's turn to it. Mormonism. Huh? Did you find it? Are you saying you know where it is, or I need
It's
to?
just beginning, that's 57.
Oh, yeah, but it's almost 63 now. Let's see here. Here's Joseph Smith's teaching. God himself was once as we are now and is an exalted man. That's still not the quote I'm looking for.
Well,
I think I have it here somewhere, but maybe I don't. Maybe I don't. I've read it many times. I don't see it right now. But that's pretty close, what Smith said over there. The point of it is as you are, God once was, and as God is, you will be. It's clearly Mormon teaching. Smith has this one here, I just mentioned here on page 63 at the top. I don't see it right now. Anyway, that's that. Now, Mormonism, the fact is that just about everybody has a resurrection, but you have different resurrections into glory, terrestrial bodies, celestial bodies, whether you're going to be a god, whether you're just going to live on forever and not be a god. All these things are present. And in Mormon thought, if you don't accept Mormonism today, don't worry about it, because if they're true, they're not, but if they were true, then in the next life, in your new resurrected body, you get another opportunity at it. And you'll have a lot better information to work with it. I always tell them, why do it now? Because if what you're saying is true, then I'll have a chance later on when I have far better information than what I have now to work with. Of course, if you're wrong, it's over for you. So, the old, what they call the Pascal's wager problem. Okay. They're on pretty weak ground when they argue for pre-existent spirits. You want to go to that Jeremiah 1:5 passage, before Abraham, that he knew Jeremiah before he was born, and so he must have existed as a spirit creature, and that kind of thing. Pretty weak arguments. 129 Jehovah Witnesses. So they seem to understand the significance of Adam's sin. When Adam sinned, his punishment was death. Everyone is condemned sinner because of Adam. But they do believe that when a person dies, they cease to exist. That is, you lose consciousness. You have no conscious existence. And remember, death is not non-existence. Death is separation. Not he's completely out of existence. Of course, they have these passages in Ecclesiastes, which are, they don't fully understand Ecclesiastes very well. Ecclesiastes is written from two angles, under the sun and over the sun. Under the sun is looking at it from a human standpoint, not a divine standpoint. Over the sun is looking at it from God's standpoint. Ecclesiastes is written from two vantage points, and you have to understand when the writer is speaking pessimistically or when he's speaking optimistically. And if you read it just without any recognition of what's going on in the book, you can thoroughly misunderstand the book. Mind science groups believe that human beings have the power to remove the idea of sin and hence have authority to forgive themselves. See, isn't that nice? Forgive your own sins. I forgive myself. I must be okay. I'm okay. You're okay. Of course, they really don't believe in sin and death. These are just figments of the imagination. Since the universe is not material and doesn't exist, then our actions really don't have any import. Mind science basically rejects sin. They're just into knowledge and improvement.
Aren't these the reason why that their children die if they're practicing Christian Science people is because they don't believe that the disease is real?
They don't believe it. Well, no. The fact is that they believe the existence is not real. This disease is not real, and they die. And of course, we know they die. And when they see the body die, they say, "Well, that's not the real person anyway. That's not the real body anyway." They believe that the person continues to exist in mind science. It's just that body, which is a representation of them, really is not the genuine them. The real them continues.
And assenting to employing traditional medical means would be a confession on their part that they're now dealing with something real,
Right.
And that would be a violation of their faith.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Matter of fact, I have an article that I'm writing for a law journal right now that I haven't finished. I've had it for about 6 months trying to get it done. Too busy with other things. But when I get it done, on the impact of minority religions upon development of First Amendment law, it's about a 50-page article. Sort of a small one, but it's got a whole section on Christian Science and about a poor little girl, Christian Science, that was allowed to just die in agony because they kept telling her it doesn't really hurt.
You have that in here.
I have a reference to it here,
Yeah.
but I don't have the article.
before. But
It's just a terrible story.
yeah.
So what you have, really, what we call the material world is only a projection of our spiritual sense. I mean, this is only here, and we only relate to it because our spiritual self is really sort of creating it to exist. It's like a hologram, and we can interact with it, but it's not genuine. You ever see that Star Trek movie where you got that doctor who's a hologram?
Oh, yeah.
I don't know what it is. It's one of the 2 or 3.
It's one of the newer ones.
Yeah. And he walks around, he's surgery, he works on people, he has surgery, and people talk to him and shake his hand, all sorts of things. But he's not really real. He's a visual image projected by a computer
Yeah.
that seems to have all the indications of being an actual human being and flesh and blood, but he's really just a hologram. Sort of like that.
Of course, he can't leave the ship.
Well, he can't leave the holodeck, basically,
Yeah.
because he'd be in trouble.
They dealt with that in one series.
Right, him trying to leave the ship.
Yeah, he had to get mailed somehow, emailed.
Had
somewhere.
to be mailed.
Emailed. Yeah, he actually did it.
Oh, well, I guess that's not too much different from being beamed as a human, right? I'm waiting for the beaming. That would save me all that flight time.
Yeah, there you go. That would help you a lot. You avoid those colds and stuff.
Oh, I avoid a lot of things. Okay.
Public transportation.
The New Age movement, similar ideas. The New Age ideas and mind science groups are about the same because they're both building on an Eastern mysticism. Gnosticism, as we know it, actually had influence from Greek Platonic thought, which in turn was in contact with Eastern mysticism. I don't know if you know, but in the ancient world, there was a lot of interaction between various cultures and thinking. And Greek Platonic thought was not unique to Greece. It was also found in the East. And Gnosticism, as we know it, borrowed from Greek Platonic thought, from Zoroastrianism, from Jewish mysticism, and other things. And so when you have New Ageism and you have mind science groups, they're basically about the same place. There's aspects of New Ageism that are not found in mind science. For example, mind science merely deals with the idea of understanding the world in its ontology, its nature of being. Whereas New Ageism brings in other Eastern mystic concepts like karma and reincarnation. There's nothing inherent in mind science about reincarnation, for example. So there's points of common, there's points of connection.
Pensions.
If you like here, there's points of connections, but not all the way. Okay? New Age movement, obviously in reference to humanity, the view that the bodies are fairly insignificant because you keep just moving through cycles of death and life and death and life and death and life. I always mention here, though, that do I have that here? I always find it interesting that all these movie stars like Shirley MacLaine, Tina Turner, all these people talking about reincarnation, they always had really exciting former lives. Not a one of them was a ditch digger. They're all exciting people. And what's so problematic, though, when you have people in reincarnations, when you have several people claiming to have been the same person in history.
Oh, Cleopatra, which one?
Well, lots of people were Cleopatra. So which one was? How many Cleopatras were there?
Yeah, Shirley
You got 1,000 people who were Cleopatra,
Shirley MacLaine was Cleopatra.
And so I guess the biggest one has a public stage, huh? So all the souls are in a cyclic kind of pattern of life and death, and it's cyclical, going around and around. The law of karma. Karma, here's good if you haven't looked at karma. Karma is the fixed and immutable law which states that a person pays for the evil or good he does in this life by suffering or being rewarded for it in the next life. So as a person does in this life, they receive in the next life. You get rewarded or punished in the next life.
Truth.
Well, in this life, you have reward and punishment for what you do, in the sense of reaping and sowing, but you don't get that in the next life.
What about the doctrine of reward?
Well, not in the sense that. The way it works in this system, though, is that if I do bad in this life, then I get worse in the next life. And then if I do well in that life, then I might jump up in the next life. And so you actually, it's true in the biblical doctrine of rewards, what you do in this life ultimately receive a reward. It doesn't deal with salvation, it deals with reward.
Right.
But there's not a punishment as we think of it. There's a lack of reward, but there's not a negative in the sense of, when you stand at the judgment seat of Christ, he's not going to say, okay, instead of getting 3 crowns, you get 5 whips on the back.
Right.
It's not a doctrine of punishments, it's a doctrine of rewards. So that's a difference. And secondly, in the next life, you don't get a chance to
Go further on.
you don't get a chance to sort of make up for it all and hopefully get a boost as you do in this.
Kind of a continuum.
Karma is the Jewish thought. It was a Jewish.
No, karma is just basically an Eastern thought.
Is that?
Now, it came out of Hinduism. Buddhism came out of Hinduism. And that's what all comes basically in the Hinduism is the oldest Eastern thought. Many of the religions like Confucianism, Buddhism have influence out of Hinduism.
How far back is that go, Hinduism?
Hinduism, we know it probably about I'm just thinking 500 or 600 AD, something like that. Doesn't go back like into the like 2,000 years ago. But it was developing about the middle of the first millennium, as we know it. I believe that's true. Could be wrong. But
Muhammad's time, but then it would be different.
600.
a long, different place. Also, in this thought, it's sort of interesting that Westernized version of the incarnation always has humans coming back as humans, whereas in Eastern religious thought, you can come back as a fly. So
Is that just because the Western mindset just can't stomach the thought?
they can't
of
deal
going
with
back
that.
as-
And they've adopted, it's sort of a synchronism between Christianity and Eastern thought they've tried to bring together. In other words, they've imbibed deeply in the Western culture and they have a hard time separating themselves from everything that's been Western as they move into Eastern thought. They pick up what they like.
It's like a potluck.
I want to be a mayfly. They don't last 3 or 4 days.
They what?
A mayfly, fish, trout go.
It lasts 3 or 4 days?
Yeah, they hatch and there's 3 or 4 days, they mate and the whole thing's over.
It's over.
So,
That's what you want to
then
be
you
over?
feed the trout.
Okay. Know what your life expect,
Food for
what your
fish.
concerns are. Okay.
Well, I was, but then I got into seminary and I can't believe that
All
anymore.
right, good. It's good to know you've got rid of that. Have you read the doctrinal statement we have? That you're supposed to agree with that general doctrinal statement. Have you read that?
Yeah.
Oh, good. I'm glad to hear
I
that.
didn't sign it. No, I'm just kidding.
I'm gonna go check your records at school tomorrow.
Actually, I know we don't have time for this, but that statement's been lost from my file, which I'm kind of irritated about, but I've gotta write it again.
Really?
Yeah, now that you bring it up,
Well, that's weird. Wonder who did that.
very irritating.
Okay. Way International. It's not too prominent anymore like it used to be, but it used to be in the days of the hippie revolution that those who were more clean cut and weren't going to hippieism, but were part of the Jesus movement nonetheless. A lot of them went into Way International, which was a cult, and still is, that wanted people to be more clean cut. It's made for more people that wanted to take baths and cut their hair and that kind of thing. But some really bad thinking, though. Rejected the deity of Christ, such things. Tended to have some of the aspects of Jehovah's Witnesses even.
In what area?
Well, they are Arians. They were not Trinitarian. And tended to believe in, I believe, the idea of soul sleep. I think so. Let's look at what it says here. So the soul is a life force God breathed into the first man. God made man a living soul by giving him that which is life, but only made once. See, I think there's some truth in that. Some truth. In the sense that I think Adam served both spiritually and physically for the race. I think that's true. I don't believe each individual receives a fresh, brand new, never glorified ex nihilo soul or spirit. I think he receives a spiritual part of Adam just like he receives a physical part of Adam. But it receives, at the point of conception, an individual identity. Just like my physical self receives an identity, I think my spiritual self receives an identity. But spiritness and physicalness, I think, are both created at the point of conception. And it all comes from Adam. I think that's true. What is not true is here, page 134. The spirit placed in humans was part of God himself. I don't think we've got a part of God. Okay? Notice, when the humans fail, according to the way, they lost their spirit. Image of God in human beings has been erased, and they are no more than highly intelligent animals. So what happens then? When you're born again, you receive the Spirit of God again. See, now you get another spirit. So it's sort of a quacky way of looking, identifying soulishness as being that which was ongoing from Adam, spirit as being altogether lost, so that people without God are spiritless. And then when you receive the Spirit of God, you receive your spirit. And that kind of view, I think, is fairly unique. In reference to answering some of these groups, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. First of all, there are no beings with God from the beginning. God was by himself before he created. You can't find one biblical passage, for example, that says that God has a wife. They believe that because they believe that physical beings are basically, because God and a wife have produced humankind.
Do they have any verse, a Bible verse, that they use to justify the idea of God having a celestial wife?
No. It's all out of their other doctrine, out of their other books, prophetic statements and such. No one liked it. God has never had a wife. You can't find any examples of that. There's the old viewpoint that they don't push anymore, but the viewpoint used to be that Adam was the god of this world. And then when he had actual sexual relations with Mary, Virgin Mary, and produced Jesus. That was their actual ruling. That was their beliefs back in the 19th century. But as that became very unpopular in general society, they changed as they moved, you know.
Progressive revelation.
Yeah. The Adam as God viewpoint, they said, well, we never taught that. Of course, they have a lot of their prophets did teach it, and who are authoritative. And I think I found some stuff on Young. Brigham Young taught that. But
Well, their deal is they're so locked into this family providing for one another thing that they're willing to, they'll actually say to you, we don't care if it makes sense or not makes sense, or if it's contradictory, it doesn't matter. Because the family relationship is so strong, right?
oh yeah, very much. Of
They
course, a host of
rationalize
issues,
everything.
celestial marriage and everything, because they believe you're marrying for eternity, in general. Christ not begotten of the Holy Ghost. Christ was begotten of God. He was not born without the aid of man, and that man was God. Okay? Christ was begotten by the immortal Father in the same way that mortal men are begotten by mortal fathers. What's that? Any ideas? See? It's sexual in nature.
Oh, yeah.
The birth of the Savior was as natural as are the birth of our children. It was the result of natural action. He partook of flesh and blood. It was begotten of his Father as we were of our fathers. And I didn't put the Adam is God statement in here because they repudiate this so much, and it's older in nature. It's one of their earlier views. But it's nonetheless, it's not been repudiated, as you can see.
By the last statement you just read, are they suggesting then that God impregnated Mary
Right.
through sexual intercourse?
Yeah, sure. Because God's a man. All God is an exalted man.
And God as man manifested through Adam originally?
Adam became the progenitor of this planet. So what happens is that as you become a god, you get your own planet, and you get to be like Adam and Eve. You start your own planet up.
Cool.
That's it.
I'm going for that.
Millions of planets and millions of people that will be gods over each planet. Like Adam was a god over this planet.
Can I get a green planet, or do I have to start with dust?
You know, I don't know. I really don't know. How are we doing?
50 minutes.
Man, it's amazing.
50.
It's pretty fun.
Okay.
You'd have to have a lot of faith to be a good Mormon.
Well, you have to be incredulous. But I told you about the Mormon I talked to, a very educated Mormon, who said that he said even if the facts are against the view, I believe it nonetheless. Yeah, I talked to guys doing his master's, finishing in Fiji. Talked to him and his wife, and they offered me a Book of Mormon. I said I already had a real nice. I said I already have a real nice bound one. And they said, what do you think about it? And I said, well, let me put it this way. If I went to Israel on one of my trips, because I've been talking about my trip to Israel. If I went to Israel on my trip and asked for Jerusalem, and the guy says there is no such place, and I said for the Sea of Galilee, there was no such place. If I went to all these biblical things and nothing existed the Bible talks about, I said I wouldn't be a Christian. I wouldn't, because if it's all a bunch of baloney, I'm not going to be a Christian. And I said, my problem with the Book of Mormon is there's none of it that's provable. There's not a single example anywhere of any factual identification between what the Book of Mormon says and what we know by historical or archaeological stuff. It just doesn't exist. It's a mythological creature. I mean, it's like Middle Earth. Narnia, land of Narnia. It's the same kind of thing. And I said, so what? I said, how do you believe that? If all the facts are against the view, how can you hold the view? And he says, he said, it doesn't bother me. He said, I don't need the facts. I believe it because I have a witness of the Spirit. And I said, but your statement is contrary to the facts, the proof. He says, I'll believe it even if it is contrary to the facts. Well, I said, there's no point in discussing it. And if you don't care about facts, then there's no point of discussion.
Waste of time.
Got a witness of the Spirit, burning in the bosom.
Which
Yeah, I get it.
which spirit and which,
Well, it's not the Spirit of God, for sure.
because they contradict Jesus' facts, existence.
So it's hard to deal with a person that no matter what you show him, he won't believe it.
He doesn't want to.
So what has to happen in a person like that is somewhere down the way something has to shake them that causes them to question, the Book of Mormon or whatever, and then they may be open to discuss. But as long as life is going smooth, they'll never probably accept anything.
They're certainly not a good candidate in terms of apologetics for an evidentialist approach.
No, they have to be shaken, and something emotional, something has to happen in their life that shakes their faith in Mormonism.
Right.
Tragedies do that, and sometimes that opens up a way to talk to people. But as it is now, as long as life's going smooth, you'll probably be right in there. Okay. Page 136. Contrary to Mormon teaching, human beings have no existence before birth. The body and soul of each person is formed in his or her mother's womb. Scriptures speak of God having known Jeremiah before he formed him in the womb, but this is not hint at pre-existence, but rather God's foreknowledge and omniscience. Jehovah's Witnesses do not believe that the spiritual aspect of it survives death. They believe it's non-existence, and we've already discussed that. Notice the statement they're always quoting in Ecclesiastes and Psalms. It says nothing about consciousness after death, but of a person's earthly knowledge and participation in earthly events. In other words, after you're, and this is against Spiritism, after you die, you don't get to have an influence on what's going on in the world. doesn't even indicate that you even know. I know people think, well, listen, we're right down here studying, and maybe Dad is looking down on me right now. He's sitting in the chair over there examining and looking at what I'm doing. That idea that you have people who die, that is, their spirit is separated from their body, hang around and observe what's going on. They're here and sort of paying attention to it all. There's no evidence that people, after they've departed, stay around. And yet that flies in the face of a lot of our television stuff, and even Christians' views, that, Dad and Mom are watching over us. It's the same view that people, when they die, become angels.
Don't you think most of that is coming out of a psychological hope that they don't want to be disconnected bodily, and so
Sure.
that's their compensation for that? and
Probably so.
It's their connecting point.
Yeah. It's just not biblical.
It's not.
They say that they have a rich inheritance.
Contrary to mind science denial and do-it-yourself forgiveness, the Apostle John writes, if we claim to be without sin, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. Well, that seemed to fly in the face of the idea of people who say we don't have sin. And God's remedy for sin is not to confess our sin to ourselves. I don't need to confess my sin to myself. I quite know I did it. I mean, why do I need, who sinned, to know that I sinned? I mean, I know
You
I
have to
did.
agree with yourself.
I agree with myself. Self, did you sin? No, I didn't. Well, it's all right. I didn't sin.
You're absolved.
But if I agree with myself, then I'm definitely. See, that's just playing games. If we claim we've not sinned, we make him a liar. See, confession our sin to God is what deals with sin. The fact is that people are sinners. The Bible says much about that. I've got that on page 137. 138, Rosicrucians also believe in pre-existence of the Spirit. Of course, they really believe that the spiritual world and us are, what our individual spirits are merely a sort of emanations of the divine Spirit. You have one Spirit of which we're just sort of like, you ever seen a thing of soup? And you sort of have a pop as it's boiling. We're like little pops. The soup is God, and when we show a sense of individuality, we really are part of God, but we just sort of look like we're independent. So like we're just little pops of soup.
That makes me feel important.
Huh?
That makes me feel important.
Oh, good. I know you are important. Yeah. The New Age movement. The New Age movement, as you well know, they believe that God is one and we're all part of God. And actually, so Shirley MacLaine, remember, she ran up and down the seashore saying, I am God, I am God, I am God, I am God. Somebody would walk up there and slap her real good and find out that God hurts. But then again, I don't know whether she could get on to anybody because the person who slapped her is also God, so God's slapping God, and how can God be mad at God for slapping himself? That makes sense? No, really. I was reading I think it's Jay-Z Knight. I was reading somebody, a New Age, one of her books, some woman's books. So many of the New Agers are women. I don't know what that is. But a woman was talking about, she was taking a glass of milk and she was thinking about this grandiose thought, I'm God. And then she looked at her milk and she said, but everything is God. God is one. I mean, God is all is God. So I'm God, this milk is God. She was drinking milk. She says, God is drinking God. And she's just saying, this is phenomenal. It's brilliant thinking here. They used to put people in straitjackets for that kind of stuff, but it's just...
they don't have enough jackets anymore.
Yeah, it's just, ever learning, never becoming knowledge of the truth kind of stuff. It's just stupid. She's contemplating that God is drinking God.
That's just stupid.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. That's just more my kind of thing.
But that's where they're at. You got to go to the New Age Carnival with me sometime, witness for a couple of
I
days.
would make it there about 2.2 minutes.
You think you'd ever become impatient with them?
You wouldn't get critical, would you, Craig?
Not in my nature, Jeff.
That's it.
You got to love.
You're inclusive, you have to be inclusive.
Let me paint you one.
Yeah.
Hmm. How do people in the New Age movement, if they don't define between good and evil, how do they deal with things like war?
Well, it's usually on a pragmatic level rather than an ethical level. See, in true Hindu thought, if all reality is one, then there's no true distinction between good and evil.
Right.
And if there's no true distinction between good and evil, then whether I slap you in the face or cut your head off,
Doesn't matter.
or whether I give you a kiss on the cheek or a rose, they're different acts, but no act is better or worse than another act, in a true sense. I mean, if a person is truly consistent with the thought, you can't distinguish good and evil. But the thing is, they're not consistent. It's like the kind of thing, they'll be concerned about things that they want to be concerned about and unconcerned about the other. I mean, how do you treat truth as irrelevant and relative in religion, and yet you're concerned about truth in your bank statement? They're inconsistent, and they're not willing to recognize that they are inconsistent. That's how they live life. They can't live life consistently. Follow their train of thought all the way through.
Simplicity.
They would have no incentive to obey a law because there's not anything that's good or evil. So
But they do, because they deal with issues like tranquility and peace and not causing disturbances, and they work on
that
a.
in itself recognizes there are disturbances.
Oh, I
You
know.
would just say though, that's a street level, that's a street reality, my bank account, whether the guy.
Or even how you deal with people is a street reality. To
Could you
get
just
along,
law
it's
that?
it's pragmatic in nature.
That's what I would do if I had that religion. It would work in my family when I was home, but when I went to work, that's another level. Just wall it off, right? My religion is Sunday, it's in another set of walls, and I just wall it off.
For sure.
That's what I do.
Okay, guys, if you'll turn that thing off, we'll take off on this tomorrow night with, we'll deal with the issue of the atonement and salvation. And maybe the second coming tomorrow night. That pretty well gets us to the end. We have doctrine and awards, that's just a tiny bit more. And then Saturday we'll finish up on this and also look at this book. Okay? You have your book with you?
Well, I have to bring my dad back from.
You don't have your book though.
I don't have my.
I've got an extra copy in the car if I'd known. I wouldn't get it at break.
There's 38 minutes on that.
30, I can do that before break time, yeah, 30 minutes, all right. So
It's done.
the atonement, chapter 8. Now, see, in some respects, we're going over some of the same ground that's learned in theology. And some of you have had the theology, some of you haven't. So, but atonement deals with the death of Christ. And there are some unbelievable teachings in this area done by those who are in cults and false religious views. I think in here we're dealing with what Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, and you notice I tend to deal with them. The reason why, because they are the most predominant and evangelistic in nature. Of course, in miracles, it's just strange. Christadelphians, these are all groups that have major flaws in their understanding of atonement. Although in reality, I guess we could have put the Word Faith movement in here with people like Copeland and Hagen with the Jesus died spiritually viewpoint that they have advocated, which is that Jesus' death on the cross did not forgive us of our sins. Actually, it was the fact that he had to go to hell and suffer himself as a sinner by Satan, and he was redeemed out of hell. Just an unbelievable concept. But the atonement is what provides forgiveness. It's the way that God looks at us. Remember this passage in Genesis 3:15. I think you guys dealt with this in Hebrew class, didn't you? And I'm not sure what Dr. Retman said on this, but As I understand the passage, this is actually the proto-evangelium. Proto-evangelium, the first gospel. Evangelium is the word for gospel, proto the first. And that's the technical term that's used in biblical circles. The first gospel. That is, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. When you read that passage, I'm not sure all that Adam and Eve understood. But this is God stating this. And God understood. Remember, in the New Testament, we find out that Jesus was the Lamb of God slain before the foundation of the world. So even before there was a world, even before there was a creation, and only what existed is God, in the mind of God, Jesus was the slain lamb. It's a phenomenal concept. There was no one to die for. In time, space, history. And yet God, knowing all things, knew that in fact when he created Adam and Eve that they would fall. He knew that before he did it. And there's a new book, as I mentioned last time, this heretical book called Wild at Heart, that's selling like crazy in churches and people, evangelicals eating it up and imbibing false theology, that essentially says that God took a risk when he created Adam and Eve, because he wasn't sure what they might do. And so he took this risk, and lo and behold, they fell. And so then he had to figure a way to deal with it.
Man.
People who say things like that simply are biblically illiterate. I mean, and logically nonsensical. I mean, if Christ was slain before the foundation of the world, the fall of Adam and Eve was not a surprise to God. A person might say, well, then why did God create Adam and Eve if he knew they would fall? Well, I can take you through the whole Bible and say, why did God do this and this and this, since he knew what people would do. Why did Jesus pick Judas, since he knew he would betray him? The point of it is, there is an interaction between the eternal state of God and the time-space history of human beings. And God knows all, but God allows humans to do what in fact humans choose to do. But they don't do it without God's knowledge, nor do they do it without God's permission. I'm preaching tomorrow on Ephesians 2, 1 through 10.
Sunday.
Is that Sunday? Seems like tomorrow. I'm preaching Sunday on Ephesians 2, 1 through 10. And, when you read that passage about grace through faith that needs to be developed, it was surrounded by some tremendous ideas there that I won't do now. But it indicates that God loved us, and that served as the basis of his mercy toward us. And I like the passage that says he's rich in mercy. Wonderful terminology, plutos. He's rich in mercy. Because he loved us. And so, when you have people that are chosen from the foundation of the world, remember, not only is Christ slain from the foundation of the world, but Ephesians 1 tells us that we're chosen before the foundation of the world. God is making decisions before there was a statement, "Let there be." All human history, from the initiation to the ending, was already decided in the mind of God. There are no surprises to God. God is not frustrated because He is not surprised. I mean, some people like surprises. God doesn't have surprises, and it doesn't bother Him not to have surprises. He knew the end from the beginning. When He said, "Let there be," He also knew everything that would occur until the end of the world. And nothing catches Him by surprise. There are no risks with God. I can't believe when people say those things. Like Jack Sanders' book, "The God Who Risks," and he believes that God does not know everything. God is finding out, and even says that God makes mistakes. God tries His best, and He blows it on occasion, and then He corrects Himself because He's a good learner, and He readjusts and does it better next time. There's so many implications of that to the nature of God. And so when you look at this passage and it says, God says to Adam and Eve, He says, "I will put enmity between your seed and her seed." He's talking to the serpent, who at that point is representing Satan. And He says, "One day your head will be crushed, even though you'll bite the heel of her seed." Adam and Eve probably did not understand what that meant.
I'd say most likely they didn't.
It's a fairly obscure statement. But it plays out and becomes more and more and more clear through the Old Testament, that concept that's being developed. That there's a war going on between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. There's a war going on. And so when you get to the time of the New Testament, I think that portion of the Passion of the Christ in Mel Gibson's film is just so dramatic.
When is that on?
That when He's struggling in the garden, and some of us have been in that garden, and some of us will be there, and struggling in that garden, and then all of a sudden you see this resoluteness just hit His face. And He stands up and crushes the head of the serpent. I thought that was really dramatic. But that's what happened at the cross. The cross is so foundational. And even though I talked last time about the importance of the resurrection, the physical body, the resurrection, all those things obviously are important. It's not as though some of these things are unimportant. And these things they are connected. You have to talk about the death, burial, resurrection, ascension complex. It's a unit. The whole incarnational event is a package. But it's at the death that ultimately our sins were forgiven. And that's what the atonement's about. Now, in the Old Testament, the atonement was in a prefiguring sense. Remember, were people's sins actually forgiven in the Old Testament? And it says they weren't. They were covered over, but they were not forgiven. Why is that? Because the blood of bulls and goats, the writer of Hebrews tells us, could never forgive sins. See, so here you have this sacrificing taking place from Abel, righteous Abel, until the days of Jesus. You had sacrifice. Thousands and thousands of animals were sacrificed. Who knows how many? During that period, even when Solomon consecrated the temple, there was a phenomenal amount of animals sacrificed. And yet all these sacrifices, and yet all those thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands probably of animals that were sacrificed. After all was said and done, not a sin was forgiven.
That's right.
That's the importance. But God, again, the key is that God is not taken by surprise. Because even though those things are occurring and human beings' sins are not being forgiven, they are being covered over. That is, God is not charging sin against someone because He knows that one day in time and space history, the true Lamb slain from the foundation of the world in anticipation, not in reality. Remember, He was not slain in reality from the foundation of the world. He was slain in anticipation from the foundation of the world. It was a proleptic slaying. That one day, around AD 33 in April, mid-April, there would be a time in which on the very day the Lamb would be slain in time, space, history. And since he knew that would take place in reality, is there any possibility Jesus had not been slain on the cross? Any possibility? No, there's no possibility. Zero. So, did he have a right to choose not to be slain then? There's that big issue of free will and sovereignty issue. Well, there was no possibility that he would not be slain. There was no possibility he would not choose to go to the cross. There was no possibility. And so I'm not willing to argue with open theists who want to say there is a possibility that he would not have. There was no possibility. There's no possibility in the sense that if he really could have, then all of human history is undone. All of God's knowledge is uncertain. And if God is an uncertain God, God is not true God, and there is no God to talk about. It's almost like, you have a chain reaction that explodes the universe. And all reality comes to a halt. There's no possibility that Jesus would not die on the cross. And because God knew that from the eternity, that it would take place in time, space, universe, he then could cover all the sins. Because he's saying, well, I really can't forgive you now because there's no real basis to forgive you. See, God does not just simply forgive just to forgive. God, because he's a holy God, must have justice. You understand me? God can't simply say, well, no big deal. Everybody sins. No big deal. Everybody makes mistakes. See, the point of it is God doesn't make mistakes and God doesn't sin. And so human beings, when they sin, become an affront to God. Remember, that's why David in Psalm 51, against you have I sinned. Well, I thought he sinned against Uriah when he had him killed and Bathsheba when he committed adultery. I thought he sinned against her. And Israel. He says, against you and you only have I sinned. Now that's an exaggeration, but the point that David was making was that ultimately sin's against God, not against others. It's secondarily against others, it's primarily against God. And so this affront against God's holy nature requires payment. God can't simply say, it's okay. So all these people sinning, the blood of the bulls and goats are merely serving to hold off the wrath of God and the forgiveness of God until such time as the one who in time, space, history would come and die. Now when Jesus actually died on the cross, at that instant, then all people's sins were forgiven. And had he not died, their sins would not have been forgiven, and they were... How do you remove them from heaven? I guess you remove them from heaven and take them back to hell or something. I don't know. How do you undo all of that? You don't have to, though, see, because it was certain, it's 100% certain that he would die.
At the moment he died, or at the moment he was resurrected?
Well, no, I think at the moment he died.
That the price was paid.
The price was paid. If he had not been resurrected, then it would have been a lie in his death. These things connect together. I'm not trying to separate. It's that certain things take place. If he had not been born a man into this world, he wouldn't be able to die, right? And he had to die in order to be buried. He had to be buried in order to be resurrected. He had to be resurrected in order to be ascended. He had to be ascended. All these things connect. So, if he had not been raised from the dead, then it would be a lie that he died to save us. That's the point that Paul makes. If Christ be not raised, you're yet in your sins. Why? Not because the resurrection doesn't forgive the sins. The resurrection affirms the truthfulness of the cross. It's the seal of the cross. If there was no resurrection, the cross was a lie. And Jesus' death was no more value than the guys that were next to him. The two on either side of Jesus, their death didn't have any impact on forgiving sins. Neither would Jesus's have had impact if he didn't rise from the dead. because he would be a liar as to who he was.
A liar simply because he said, death cannot hold me.
Well, he said yes, and because
3 days.
a lot of things. I mean, the Old Testament prophecies are lies. He's a liar when he said, I'll put my life down and I'll raise it up. He said, you put me to death, and in 3 days, I mean, Jesus is a liar. The prophets is a liar. I mean, you have an absolute fraudulent perspective being advocated. And God's a liar. Then, see, if the Old Testament's a liar, God's a liar. And if God's a liar, then we got a problem. So that's why. The cross is fundamental because the cross is the actual event in which what was anticipated from all eternity and through time and space events and prophecies were fulfilled. Well, I've talked about this a little bit here. Let's just look at the terms. I think I've said probably more as much as needs to be said. You can read the book. The Hebrew word here, kathar, to cover, and I think I've already talked about that, the issue of the atonement, no forgiveness. I mean, I went through all these passages. This is a great passage in Isaiah 53. So, I mean, surely he took up our infirmities and carried our sorrows, yet we considered him stricken by God, smitten in him, by him and afflicted. That's the human appraisal of the cross. Then you have the word but. I love these buts. I've got a but in the sermon on Sunday. You've got to watch for those because that sort of changes the whole tenor of what's being said. That's how we evaluated him, but our evaluation is wrong. For in reality, he was pierced for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. That says it's vicarious, which means that he's not guilty. And substitutionary, that is, not merely that he died on the cross for us. That's important. But no, it's not that he died for us, he died in our stead. And a lot of people have not thought through that very well. The Reformation and the scholars and the theologians of the time or since the Reformation have argued very strongly for a view that's called the substitutionary atonement. Not merely that he died for our sins, but he died instead of us. That's an important concept. It has a lot of importance for the issue of atonement. You think, now, what does that mean? He died in my place. Not just merely for me, but he died in my place, that I don't have to die. If Jesus took the wrath of God on himself, did he take the wrath of God on my behalf, in my place? Two concepts. In reality, or did he take it only potentially?
In reality.
Which way you go there has a lot to say about it, the issues. If every individual, Christ has actually been their substitute, and he really endured the wrath of God for them and in their place, can then they ever themselves endure the wrath of God?
Not in relation to salvation, because that's secured by that wrath being placed on him.
Well, that depends on whether you say, well, he endured the wrath of God potentially. That is, not that he really endured my wrath, but he endured the wrath of God just in case I believe. It's almost like...
You know the full package of wrath of God.
Yeah, it's the fact is, at the point, did he really just endure the wrath of God? So that if I should believe in him, he had experienced my wrath, or did he in fact endure the wrath of God, my wrath?
Well, if you did, doesn't that be an argument for universal salvation?
Well, it's an issue. That's a problem, I think. If he died on the cross in the atonement for every single individual as a substitution, then can anyone ever endure the wrath of God? That's the problem. And the whole debate of
Is that
limited
okay?
versus unlimited atonement, or sometimes called particular redemption, that's the big issue. Is Christ's death a potential issue, or is it an actual? At the cross, did something take place in reality or in potentially? See, and that to me is a real problem. And you got to work through that. Now, this isn't the place to do that. That's in theology class under soteriology. But this whole debate on limited and unlimited atonement, or particular versus universal redemption, it becomes an issue. Because it used to be that I thought, well, he died on the cross, and it just became the basis of me being saved if I should at some time believe. But if he actually, at the time he endured it, actually endured my own personal wrath, then I can't ever endure it before God. There's a double jeopardy problem here. Because it makes him enduring my wrath meaningless. If I find myself under the wrath of God, and we're not talking about we're not talking about discipline, and we're talking about condemnation here. If I can endure that wrath later, then it makes Christ's death futile in reference to that issue.
Yeah.
Well, it makes God unjust in allowing him to suffer that if
Yeah.
he's going to take it twice.
Twice, yeah.
Right, because ultimately I do it, so he shouldn't have done it. So these are questions that have to be dealt with, but I just pose that problem for you to think about. But apart from that issue of substitution, it says he was pierced for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities, the punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. By the way, this healing here is not physical healing that some people try to refer to here. As you all know from Hebrew parallelism and so forth, you're talking here about spiritual healing. There is no physical healing in the atonement. Some who have the divine healing and campaigns and crusades and all these things they do and raise money and telephones and people calling in, in which people are trying to be healed, rely on the idea that the death of Christ in the atonement actually provides physical healing. If it does, we got a major, major problem.
Sure.
Because if in fact you are sick at all, the atonement was futile. For the same way that once I placed my faith in Jesus, I received a justification that I did not deserve. In other words, I'm declared to be innocent of all charges, and forevermore stand before God as just. Not my own righteousness, but Christ's righteousness. That occurs there. If healing is in there too, not only spiritual healing, but physical healing, at the point that I place my faith in Christ, then I should receive a body that does not actually experience any physical ailment. Because my spirit now is forever saved. I don't go back and become spiritually dead again. I'm spiritually alive in Christ, and so I would be physically alive. And so the atonement in reference to physical healing is a major problem that people have come up with. And they've used this kind of passage to deal with it. The point of it is this healing here is that's the problem sometimes in being very sloppy with our word studies and so forth. A person says the word heal, and I may not be saying it right, I realize I'm from Texas and I say things that way, but H-E-A-L, not H-E-E-L. Heal, H-I-L is a hard one. I don't know, I have a difficult time between H-E-E-L, H-E-A-L, H-I-L. I don't know which one's which, but you know what I'm saying. Divine healing, I don't think we can argue that it's in the atonement, because if so, then we really can't explain people being sick. I know that my nephews and nieces used to go to Bob Tilton's church down in Texas, in Dallas, and there's a lot of stories to be told about that. But one thing is, my brother was dying and terribly sick, and my nieces and nephews, they were saying, well, no, James, their dad, he has the symptoms of being sick, but in reality, he's been healed.
Something like mind cycles.
Yeah, he's been healed. I mean, you may think he's sick, but he's actually healed. It's happened. See, and when he died, I said, I thought he was healed. She said, well, he is. He's ultimately healed now. God has healed him. I was like, you're playing games with words. Right is wrong, and truth is error, and day is night. I mean, and death is healing. Death is not a healing. Death is the final. If the whole issue of resurrection is the fact that death has no victory, but nonetheless, death is real, and it is not a healing. It's a defeat apart from the resurrection. As far as we're concerned, death is a defeat.
That's right.
And the only reason why it's not a defeat is because of Christ. But
We have a living hope, but death is still part of what we got when we signed on to humanity.
death is the ultimate sickness.
That's right.
It's not the ultimate healing. And yet they talk that way, and I thought, you guys are often, you're bonkerland. You're using terminology that has no basis in reality. Well, why did the atonement occur then? Why did Christ have to come to die? It deals with the issue of the love of God and the justice to God. And people want to talk about the love of God, the love of God, the love of God. And that's all great, except let's talk about the justice of God. And if you don't have both, you miss it all. The fact is, and I'll turn to that passage here. There's so many great passages. But that I'm speaking on this week. And you have this statement here. But it says, and you he made alive who were dead in trespasses and sins, in which you once walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit who now works in the sons of disobedience, among whom also we all once conducted ourselves in the lust of our flesh, fulfilling the desires of the flesh, of the mind, and were by nature children of wrath. See the term wrath. Ephesians 2. Yeah. We're by nature children of wrath. That's our end, our lack of hope. But God, who is rich in mercy, because of his great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved. And raised us up together and made us sit together in the heavenly places in Christ Jesus, that in the ages to come he might show the exceeding riches of his grace in his kindness toward us in Christ Jesus. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. It is the gift of God, not of works lest anyone should boast, and so forth. Look at the statement there, verse 11. Therefore remember that you, once Gentiles in the flesh, who are called uncircumcision by what is called the circumcision made in the flesh by hands, that at that time you were without Christ, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers from the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. But now in Christ Jesus, you who once were far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ. Isn't that a great passage? The point of it is, our condition as being sinners separates us from the life of God and separates us from any hope for the future. And what changed that is the cross, the atonement. Without hope and without God, that's pretty dismal. How do you square that with people who say, well, listen, if you just do your best, God overlooks our problems, God overlooks our deficiencies. He just says, well, they're doing their best. They don't understand the justice of God. They think the love of God trumps the justice of God. The thing is, the justice of God condemns us. The love of God sent the Son to save us. But it does not deal with the fact that we, until we know Christ, have no hope. God makes provision, but He does not forego or overlook justice. God is both a just and loving God simultaneously. And He He satisfies His justice by the offering of His love, but He does not deal with that apart from belief in Christ. The blood of Christ has to be involved with that. So love and justice go together. Now, this statement in Romans 3:25 that Christ is sent into the world to be propitiation. I had a Greek professor years ago who did not like this word. He tried his best to make this mean expiation. Interesting guy. He was a Neo-Orthodox. And all my professors were Neo-Orthodox. And they were teaching me all the great ways of Karl Barth. But he didn't like the idea that this would be God with a God of wrath. He said, God's not a God of wrath. God's a God of love. That's what he kept always telling us. And this isn't propitiation. This is expiation. It's forgiveness. It's not satisfaction. See, propitiation is satisfaction. That is, God accepts something as something that appeases His wrath. That is, that satisfies His wrath. They say, well, that's a pagan view of God, some God who needs to be appeased. Well, whether he likes it or not, that's what the word means. Hilasmos in Greek does not mean expiation. It means propitiation. And it's when the death of Christ satisfies the wrath of God. But now the righteousness of God I'm in Romans 3:25 here. But now the righteousness of God apart from the law is revealed. Wasn't known before. Being witnessed by the law and the prophets, even the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ, to all and on all who believe. There is no difference, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, being justified freely by His grace, through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God set forth as a propitiation by His blood through faith to demonstrate His righteousness, because in His forbearance God had passed over the sins. See that? They weren't forgiven yet, but God knew what Jesus would do. He sent Him to do it. He was slain before the foundation of the world. There was no possibility it wasn't going to occur. But even God can't forgive sins until there is in time, space, history someone who makes satisfaction. You've always got to keep a separation between what occurs in time, space, and what occurs in eternity. And just because it's known in God's mind in eternity does not solve the problem until time, space occurs. In eternity, from God's standpoint, that's what Romans 8 is talking about. Those whom He foreknew, He also predestined. Those whom He predestined, He also called. Those He called, He justified. Those He justified, He glorified. I'm sitting here in this room with you as an unglorified person. All the other things are true now. At one time, some of those weren't true. I hadn't been yet called. I hadn't yet been justified in time and space, what really occurs. I'm waiting for glorification. It's still to come. From God's perspective, it's done. But I have to do it in time and space.
Opening a scroll, you have everything written there, but you see only this passage in front of you. You know, both the rows of the scroll.
Yeah.
It's almost like unfolding.
It is unfolding as God sort of turns the scroll. It's written, it's going to happen, but it does have to wait for time, space, history to occur. See, God in the fullness of time sent forth His Son, born of a woman, right? We know that. But this was decided before the world began that it would occur. But it still had to happen in the fullness of time. So Jesus had to die in time. I had to be justified in time. See, I will be glorified one day in time. I mean, it's certain. It will occur. That's the hope we have. I mean, that's wonderful that we know if God says it, that settles it. I mean, it's going to happen. He's not going to make a mistake and blow it. See, which is where some people are. You know, it might not occur. There may be something God doesn't know yet that will catch him off guard, and he'll say, oh boy, I thought it was going to happen that way, but it didn't, so, you know. But God knows it's going to happen, but it does still have to happen. It's like the same kind of thing I told you. For example, did God before Jesus know experientially what it was to be a man? The answer is no. He knew cognitively what it was to be a man. That is, in his mind, he understood it totally and perfectly. But you cannot know anything by experience until you experience it, definitional wise. You know, it's an apples and oranges problem. Can God ever know what it is to experience sin? Experientially. No, but he understands it totally cognitively. He will never know, for example, what it is to burn in hell forever. God won't. Even though he understands it with his mind, he does not understand it with his experience. It's not his experience. For example, will God ever know experientially what it is to be me? No. He'd have to be me to be me. You know. So, you know, that's the kind of stuff we're dealing with. The point of it is, God in eternity knows something, but it happens in time and space. And so, the point of it is, Christ has been a propitiation, that is, someone who satisfies the wrath of God, to demonstrate his justice, his righteousness, because God in his forbearance passed over the sins that were previously committed, to demonstrate at the present time, Paul says, his righteousness, that he might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Christ. And that's a great concept. He is just, that is, he's holy and righteous, and he has a standard that he does not lower the standard, because if he did, he would cease to be deity. He would cease to be God, because he'd be a sinful being. But he's also the justifier, the one who makes people just by faith in Christ. I should say, not really makes, but who declares people just by Christ's justice. So that's how it all works out. And, okay. We ready? Just shut it off and start another tape?